You'll freeze here. Or you come with me.
What are you building?
Something to move with. A chair with wheels.
The war left me hollow, but a dying girl in the dust taught me what it means to be human again. Red Willow Basin, Wyoming Territory, March 1875. The wind cut like iron filings. It hissed across the open flats, scattering dust and ice into the air, scraping against the bones of the land. That kind of wind didn't ask where you came from, it only asked if you'd last through the next mile. I was walking fence that morning, hammer in hand, wire slung across my shoulder, counting staples and pretending it all meant something. There's a rhythm to solitude. Step, tap, tie, breathe. Out here, even the sound of your own boots can start to feel like company. I'd been living alone since the war ended, repairing other men's fences, feeding cattle that weren't mine, and keeping enough distance from town that no one remembered to ask my name. The sky hung low, bruised purple. I kept my head down and worked through the cold until I saw it something small and wrong against the white crust of snow. A shred of red cloth, snagged on a thorn bush, not the color a ranch hand wears. I reached out, touched it, and felt the thread stiff with ice. Beneath it were marks, 2 deep grooves with handprints between. Someone had crawled here. I followed the trail up a shallow draw. The wind dropped to a whisper. My boots crunched through crusted snow, and every few yards the grooves deepened, the handprints closer together. Whoever made them had fought for every inch. The smell hit before I saw her, a faint mix of smoke. Hide, oil, and blood turned old. I rounded a bend and stopped. She was lying beneath a fallen cottonwood limb, wrapped in a dark blanket that looked heavy enough to drown her. Her face was turned to the ground, hair tangled with frost. One arm reached forward like she'd meant to take another pull but hadn't found the strength. I crouched. She was breathing barely. Her legs were twisted at the hip, motionless. Her hands, split and raw, told me how she'd come this far. I'd seen wounds like that before. Men who'd crawled off battlefields because they were too stubborn to die where they were told to. I said nothing, just stood there with the wind in my ears and the old ache pressing at my ribs. Then her eyes opened, black as flint, sharp even in the haze. She didn't flinch, didn't beg, just watched me. I unslung my canteen, knelt, and held it near her mouth. "Easy," I said, voice rough from disuse. "Small sips." She obeyed, trembling. The water dribbled down her chin, freezing before it hit the snow. When she stopped, her breath came shallow. "They left," she whispered. The words barely made sound, but I heard them. The West is full of sentences that start that way. "They left" can mean 1,000 things: family, tribe, platoon. It always ends the same. Her blanket was tied tight around her chest with rawhide. I could see where the shape of her spine changed near the small of her back. The injury wasn't new. It was the kind that ends a life without killing it. The land was empty all the way to the horizon. No smoke, no sound but wind and crows. I could have turned back. No one would know. Out here, mercy and cowardice often look the same from a distance. But she looked at me again, steady, proud. Her gaze had the same weight as command used to. A man either obeys or lives with, knowing why he didn't. "What's your name?" I asked. Her lips cracked when she spoke. "Naya?" Lakota, by her voice. Northern tongue. That meant she'd come far, and alone. "Caleb Boone," I said. She blinked once, reading the name like it carried more than it should. Her eyes dropped to the tarnished buckle on my belt, the remnant of a uniform I hadn't worn since Appomattox. "Soldier," she said, flat as fact. "Was," I answered. I don't know why I said what I said next. Maybe the wind went quiet just long enough for honesty. "You'll freeze here." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then I stop." "Or," I said, "you come with me." For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then her eyelids lowered in the smallest nod I'd ever seen. That was all it took. I slid my arms under her shoulders. She didn't cry out. The blanket came with her, and I felt her breath against my throat, hot and shallow like a newborn colt's. She weighed less than a sack of feed. but the weight of the choice hung heavier. My horse was tied a quarter-mile back. He shifted when he saw us, ears twitching. I settled her sideways in the saddle, wrapped her tight, and tied the blanket ends to the pommel. She kept one hand in the mane, without being told. We started slow, the wind at our backs. The basin stretched endless, flat as judgment. Every step of the horse sent a dull jolt through her body. She never complained. Halfway to the cabin, she spoke again. "You should leave me." "I tried that once," I said. "Didn't take." A sound like a faint laugh escaped her, cut short by breath, then silence. The cabin came into view near dusk, a squat shape of pine logs pressed into the hillside, smoke black around the stovepipe. A place for one man and no company. I'd built it that way on purpose. Inside, the air was sharp with old wood smoke and loneliness. I laid her near the stove, wrapped in her blanket, and fed the fire until the metal roared red. The crackle filled the space between us. She watched every move I made, measuring, wary but unafraid. I poured water into a tin cup and broke hardtack into it until it softened. When I handed it over, she hesitated, then ate slowly. "Why?" she asked at last. The question carried no bitterness, just curiosity, clean and quiet. I thought about it, about all the ghosts I'd followed west, the fences I'd built to keep from looking back, about the faces of boys I'd led into places they didn't walk out of. "Because you're here," I said finally. And I was. She studied me for a long time, then whispered, "Then you are different." I wanted to laugh, but it stuck in my throat. "No, just late." Outside, the wind had turned. Snow began to drift against the doorframe. I checked the latch, then set another log in the stove. The warmth pressed close, smelling of pine and something almost like peace. Her eyes fluttered. "Sleep?" I said. "You're safe enough for now." She shook her head once. "No one is safe," she murmured. I didn't argue. Out here, safety was just another word for luck. She slept soon after, her breathing soft and steady. I sat in the chair across from the fire, listening to it crack and hiss. The light played across her face, softening the lines of exhaustion until she looked like any other soul the West had chewed up and spit back out. I realized then I didn't feel alone. Not in the usual way. The cabin sounded alive again, one more heartbeat inside its walls. I looked at my hands. They were rough, scarred, built for tools and rifles, not for kindness. Yet they'd chosen differently today. When the fire dimmed, I leaned forward, stirring the coals. The world outside was white and endless. The wind clawed at the walls like it wanted to remind me what I'd done. Maybe it was right to. Before I banked the fire, I looked back at her once more. Her face was turned toward the heat, the edges of her hair glinting copper in the glow. I felt something move in my chest, small, stubborn, the way a seed breaks dirt. Tomorrow, I'd have to find food, maybe build something to help her move. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight the choice was simple: stay or leave her to the snow. I'd already made it. The morning came gray and slow, as if the sky itself hadn't made up its mind about living another day. I woke before the fire died, its last breath of red barely glowing under a skin of ash. For a while I didn't move. The stillness in the cabin was thick, quiet enough that I could hear her breathing from the cot. It came shallow but steady, the sound of someone who had fought too long to give up now. I poured water into a dented pot, set it over the stove, and waited for the first hiss of steam. My hands worked by memory: coffee, beans, jerky, the small routines that keep a man from thinking about everything else. I hadn't shared a morning with another soul in 2 winters. It felt strange, like using a muscle I'd forgotten I had. When I turned, she was awake. Her eyes were open and sharp, following every motion I made. She looked at me not with fear, but with the wary patience of someone who'd learned to read the world, one breath at a time. "You should eat," I said, handing her a piece of bread softened in hot water. She took it without a word, eating slow, deliberate. Every motion cost her something, but she didn't let it show. The firelight caught the edge of her cheekbone, the copper hue beneath the dust and exhaustion. She was young, younger than she'd first looked lying out there in the snow, but her eyes carried old miles. "You live alone here?" she asked after a while, her voice rough but clear. "Most days," I said. "Sometimes it's easier that way." Her head tilted. "Easier than what?" Then explaining why. Her mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then we are the same." Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls, a low moan through the cracks. I poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed her one. She held it with both hands, inhaling the steam like it was something sacred. For a while we drank in silence. There was no need to fill the air with words. People who have lived too close to death don't waste breath on chatter. After a time, she said, "You fought." I didn't answer right away. "Yes," I said finally. "Which side?" "The one that lost." She nodded once, as if that told her everything she needed to know. Maybe it did. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Her eyes dropped to my hands as I poured more coffee. "The scar," she said quietly. "From battle?" I glanced at my forearm, where the white line cut from wrist to elbow. "Shrapnel. Long time ago." "You still feel it?" "Every winter," I said, flexing the fingers. "Some things don't heal. They just stop bleeding." Her gaze didn't leave mine. Like me. I didn't argue. The truth didn't need agreement to be real. She reached toward the cup again, her hands trembling. "My tribe, Lakota, they left when I could no longer walk. They said the spirits had taken the strength from my legs, that I was marked." "Marked how?" "By shame. By weakness. They said it was better to let the desert decide my fate." I looked at her then, really looked. The steady jaw, the thin lines of muscle still strong above her blanket, the dark hair pulled away from her face. There was nothing weak about her. Just broken in the way life breaks everyone eventually. "They were wrong," I said. She watched me, as if testing whether I believed it myself. "Maybe," she said at last. "Or maybe they were just afraid." I stood, stepped outside, and let the door swing behind me. The morning air hit like cold steel. Snow had crusted the ground in patches. My horse whickered softly near the corral. I fed him oats and looked toward the horizon, pale gold spreading behind the hills. I'd spent years chasing quiet like this, thinking it was peace. But now, with someone breathing inside my walls, it felt different, less like escape, more like waiting. When I came back in, she had pulled herself upright on the cot, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She nodded, slow. "Some men don't." "I'm not some men." Her lips pressed together at that, neither smile nor frown, just understanding. I dropped a small pile of wood beside the stove. "We'll need more heat. The snow's not done yet." "The Gan forces," and they said for the go amin, and bead on the sand of Ganders and body. "Let me help," she said. "You can barely sit. I can use my hands." There was no arguing with that kind of pride. I passed her a small knife and a strip of bark. She began shaving curls from it, steady despite the tremor in her fingers. It was clumsy work, but it mattered that she tried. While she worked, I started cutting down 2 wagon spokes I'd scavenged from the shed months back. The sound of the saw filled the cabin steady, rhythmic, alive. She watched me with quiet curiosity. "What are you building?" she asked. "Something to move with," I said. "A chair with wheels. Might not be pretty, but it'll get you across the floor." She frowned, uncertain. "Why?" "Because crawling ain't living." For a long time she didn't speak. Then, softly, "No one ever built something for me." I kept my eyes on the wood. "Then it's about time someone did." The hours passed, in a hush, broken only by the crackle of fire and the occasional sigh of the wind. When the frame began to take shape, she leaned closer, studying the joinery. "You build like a man who's done this before." "I build like a man who's had to start over," I said. By late afternoon, I had the wheels fixed, a rough backrest nailed in place, and a small bar across the front, crude but solid. I dragged it near the cot, and nodded toward her. "You ready?" She hesitated, eyes darting between the chair and me. "If it breaks, then we fix it." Hate, supper. With careful hands I lifted her, felt the frailness of her weight, the heat of her breath. She stifled a groan but didn't cry out. When she settled into the seat, her whole body went still. Her hands found the wooden rims. She pushed once, and the chair rolled forward a few inches. She gasped. Then, slowly, she laughed. The sound startled us both. "It works," she said. "Guess it does." I stepped back, letting her push again. The wheels creaked, scraping over the rough floorboards, but they held. She turned the chair in a small circle, smiling through tears she tried to hide. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The fire popped, the horse stamped outside, and the world seemed to pause just long enough to remember what mercy felt like. When night came, I fixed supper beans, coffee, a slice of dried meat. She ground a handful of corn from her pouch, baked it into a flat cake on a hot stone. The smell filled the cabin, warm and human. When we ate, I noticed her shoulders had eased, her breathing steadier. "Why did you stop?" she asked suddenly. "Stop what?" "Riding. You could have left me there." I poked the fire with a stick. Sparks jumped like stars. "Because I saw tracks that didn't belong to an animal. They looked like someone trying to live." She nodded. "And you followed them." "I did." "You could still have turned back." "Could have," I said. "Didn't want to." "In the you nod." She studied me, and I saw something shift behind her eyes, small, quiet trust. "Then maybe you were meant to find me." "I don't believe much in meaning," I said. "Just choices." "Maybe that's the same thing," she said softly. Her words hung there, light as smoke. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the call of a lone coyote somewhere beyond the ridge. I reached for my rifle, checked the chamber out of habit, then set it down again. Old instincts die hard. When she finally lay back to rest, I sat near the fire, listening to the creak of the chair's wheels as they cooled. The sound was oddly comforting. It reminded me that something I built had brought someone back from crawling to standing tall again, even if it was on wheels. The thought pulled at a memory I hadn't touched in years. A soldier under my command, bleeding out by the river, whispering, "Don't let it be for nothing." I'd buried that promise under a decade of silence. But looking at Naya asleep, I realized maybe this keeping one person alive was the closest I'd ever come to keeping that promise. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight, and watched the fire settle. Her breathing was slow, even, the kind that means a soul finally trusts the night not to take it away. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost wandering through borrowed land. I felt useful. And that, out here, was as close to grace as a man like me could hope for. The third morning came with a sky the color of pewter and light so thin it barely touched the hills. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean but fragile, as if one wrong step might shatter it again. I woke to the smell of wood smoke and the faint rustle of someone moving. Naya was awake before me. She sat in the chair by the window, hair loose down her back, her blanket draped like the feathers of a wounded bird learning how to rest again. She had turned the chair toward the dawn and was watching the light crawl across the floor. "You sleep at all?" I asked, my voice still thick with the quiet of morning. She shook her head. "The night talks too much." I poured coffee, the sound of the liquid breaking the silence between us. "What does it say?" "Everything I'm trying to forget," she said softly. We didn't speak again for a while. The sun edged higher, turning the frost on the window into glittering threads. I made us breakfast beans, a few shavings of dried venison, and coffee thick enough to chew. She ate slow, careful, like someone remembering what hunger used to mean. When she finished, she said, "You never ask what happened. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. Most men want the story before they decide if it's worth helping. I'm not most men." That earned a faint smile. "No," she said, "you're not." We went outside after breakfast. The wind had lost its bite, and the snow was melting into narrow veins of water that glimmered between rocks. The land looked different in sunlight, still harsh, but alive in a way I hadn't seen in months. "I can work," she said suddenly. "Work?" I looked at her, unsure. "I can use my hands. Teach me something. Don't make me sit like a ghost." There was no pleading in her voice, only resolve. The same stubbornness that must have dragged her across miles of dust before I found her. "All right," I said. "You can help with the woodpile. We'll see how you do with a knife." Her eyes lit up, a spark beneath the calm. I brought a small block of pine and a carving blade, setting them on her lap. Her fingers were steady but slow. She began shaving curls from the wood, each stroke careful, deliberate. The rhythm of it, the scrape of knife, the hiss of wind, the faint crack of thawing ground settled something in the cabin. For the first time, it didn't sound like a tomb. By mid-morning I was outside chopping logs. When I turned, I caught her watching me. Her eyes followed the motion of the axe, the rise and fall, the swing through the grain. "What?" I asked, half smiling. "You move like someone still fighting," she said. "Maybe I am." "With who?" "Mostly myself." She nodded, as if she understood that better than I ever could. When the last log split, I set the axe down. "You ever learn to shoot?" I asked. She raised an eyebrow. "We hunted bison when I was a child. I could draw a bow before I could speak." "Well, a rifle's a different beast." I fetched my old Winchester from the wall. "Recoil will talk back if you don't respect it." Her lips twitched in amusement. "Like men." I chuckled. "Something like that." I showed her how to brace it, how to line the sight with the ridge. Her hands trembled at first, but her eyes narrowed with focus. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the valley, echoing like thunder. A puff of dust rose from the rock 20 yards away. She exhaled, shoulders relaxing. "Again? Until the sound doesn't scare you." She fired 4 more times, each one steadier than the last. By the end, her hands were firm, her aim straight. "Good," I said, lowering the rifle. "Most men I knew couldn't shoot that well on their best day." "I told you," she said. "I hunted." "Yeah, but you didn't tell me you were born for it." "Have overdawned." That made her laugh, a sound light and real, cutting through the wind like sunlight on metal. It startled me more than the gunfire. When we went back inside, she wheeled herself close to the stove. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and for the first time, I noticed how young she still was, maybe 20, 21. A lifetime ahead if the world let her keep it. "You look different," I said without thinking. "Warmer? Alive." Her eyes softened. "Then I'll try to stay that way. Thank you for watching." And the tendons of different. The days followed that rhythm. Morning chores, practice at noon, silence in the evenings. Sometimes we talked about the land, its cruelty, its beauty. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. But each day, the quiet between us changed shape. It stopped being empty. One afternoon, while I was patching the fence, I saw her outside. She had wheeled herself to the creek and was watching the water slide between stones. The wind played with her hair, and for a moment, I forgot the limpness in her legs. I saw only grace. When I approached, she didn't turn. "I used to think the river ended somewhere," she said. "Now I know it just disappears into other rivers. Maybe people are like that too." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe we're the rocks that stay." She smiled faintly. "Then, you are the rock. I am the water." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is," she said. "Water shapes the rock, but the rock keeps it from being lost." Her words sank deeper than she knew. We stayed by the creek until the sun began to fall, turning the water gold. A hawk circled above us, its wings catching the light. Naya watched it carefully. My mother said when a hawk circles twice, it means the spirits are listening. "How many circles today?" I asked. She watched the sky for a long moment. 2, she said quietly. That night, the wind changed. Warm air moved up from the south, carrying the scent of wet earth and promise. I sat outside by the fire, cleaning my knife, when she spoke behind me. "You don't talk about your ghosts," she said. "They've had enough of my voice. Still, they walk with you." Maybe they like the view, I said. She smiled faintly, rolling closer. You think saving me made them quieter? I poked at the fire. Maybe it made me quieter. She looked into the flames. Where I come from, when two souls cross paths and share food, their fates are bound until one stops breathing. He's and 8 my cadence of the dater. So, some of aided, C of the dater, that sounds like trouble. Everything worth living for is. Her eyes caught the firelight, amber, fierce, alive. I couldn't look away. When she finally turned toward the door, I felt the cold settle back in. I realized I'd been warmer just standing near her. Later, inside, she hummed a low tune while I watched from the table. The sound filled every corner of the cabin. I didn't understand the words, but I felt them, the kind of song that remembers pain but refuses to live in it. You sing like the land listens, I said. It always listens, she replied. We just forget how to hear it. When the song faded, I said softly, You ever think about going back to your people? Her eyes lowered. They buried me when they left. There's no place for the living among the dead. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, feeling the weight of her truth settle between us. Outside, a coyote called across the ridge, its voice lonely but proud. Naya smiled faintly. He sings for his mate, she said. Even when she's gone, he sings until the night answers. I stared at the fire, the sound echoing in my chest. That's a kind of faith I lost a long time ago. Then maybe you'll find it again, she whispered. She drifted to sleep soon after, her breathing slow and even. I sat awake, listening to the wind move through the eaves, the faint creak of her chair, the sound of her life against the quiet. For the first time in a decade, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like prayer. And I realized then, it wasn't just her learning to live again. It was me too. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you. 3 days later, I woke to the sound of hooves, the kind of sound that freezes a man's blood before his mind catches up. At first, I thought it was just wind and imagination, but then came the low jingle of harness metal. Not one horse, two, maybe three. Slow, steady, unhurried. Men who knew how to ride quiet. I glanced at Naya. She was by the fire, stirring a pot of corn mush, humming softly. When she noticed my expression, the hum stopped. What is it? Riders, I said. Her hands stilled. Bluecoats? Too few, I said. Maybe drifters. Maybe worse. I stepped outside, rifle in hand. The sky was a bruised gray, heavy with the promise of rain. 3 figures were coming down the ridge, dusty coats, broad hats, rifles slung loose across their saddles. The kind of men who thought law was something that happened to other people. I waited by the fence until they were close enough for words. Morning, the first one called. He was lean, long-jawed, eyes like dry glass. Didn't expect to see a place out here. Not much to see, I said. He smiled without warmth. We're just passing through. You alone? Mostly. The man's gaze drifted toward the cabin. Heard there was an Indian girl limping around these parts. You wouldn't have seen anyone like that, would you? Every part of me went still. Can't say I have. Heself. He seven zal the give the mosted prife. He studied me for a long time, the way a coyote studies a trap before deciding if it's worth losing a paw over. Then he nodded to the others. Let's water the horses. They rode past me like they owned the air itself. The smell of dust and sweat followed. Inside the cabin, Naya's face had gone pale. I know them, she whispered. They were with the traders. When I couldn't walk anymore, they left me. I thought they were gone. They're not gone, I said. They're here. He's Lige. After 2. 8 ses. 40 plays in the Seven. She looked at me, eyes wide but steady. If they see me, they'll finish what they started. Then they won't see you. I helped her into the corner behind the woodpile, draping a blanket over her. Don't move. Don't breathe unless you have to. I stepped back outside. The men had dismounted. One of them, a red-bearded brute, was rummaging through the barrel by the corral. The leader looked up when he saw my rifle. You got company, friend? He asked, feigning casual. Just ghosts, I said. He laughed. You one of those soldier boys who still thinks ghosts mean something? Only when they ride in threes, I said. The smile faded. His hand hovered near his holster. The air tightened. For a moment, all I could hear was wind and the creak of saddle leather. Then he shrugged, spit, and turned his horse. We'll be moving on. Water's no good here anyway. I waited until they were specks on the ridge before I breathed again. When I went inside, Naya was still hidden, her eyes wide and shining in the dim light. I helped her out, and she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. You didn't have to lie for me. Yes, I did. Why? Because it's the first time I've had something worth lying for. Her fingers loosened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, You'll die if they come back. Maybe, I said, but not before I give them a reason to regret it. Tour, ads, vi them des, by the non-be and serm. The rest of the day passed under a silent wait. I cleaned the rifle twice, checked the revolver, cut fresh notches into the fence posts that could hold lanterns in a pinch. When the sun dipped, I stacked more wood by the door. Naya watched every movement. Do you think they'll return? She asked. Men like that always do. Trouble's the only compass they trust. She nodded, quiet for a long time. When I was a child, she said softly, my father told me there are two kinds of men, those who run toward the fire, and those who let it burn. Which one are you? I'm the fool who thinks he can put it out. That earned a small, sad smile. Then I'll hold the water. Night came with no stars. Clouds pressed low, black as smoke. I sat by the door, rifle across my knees. Naya was awake behind me, the flicker of firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. Do you ever get tired of being brave? She asked. All the time. Then why keep doing it? Because fear's not something you beat once. You beat it every morning, same as hunger. She was quiet a while. Then, if they come, don't die for me. I turned, met her eyes. I won't die for you, Naya. I'll fight beside you. That's different. Her throat worked, but no sound came. Then she reached out, took my hand for the first time. Her skin was warm, her grip firm. The kind of touch that says more than words ever could. The storm broke near midnight. Rain came hard, slashing against the roof. Thunder rolled across the basin like cannon fire. Each flash of lightning painted her face pale and fierce. I sat awake, listening for more hooves, but none came. Only the steady rhythm of rain and her quiet breathing beside the stove. By dawn, the world smelled clean again. The air was soft, the kind that makes you think maybe you'll live to see something good. When I stepped outside, the ridge was empty. No tracks, no smoke, just the land, unbothered. They're gone, I said when I came back in. For now, she replied. I smiled faintly. You always expect the worst? Expecting keeps me alive, she said, but hoping keeps me human. That's a good line, I said. It's not a line, she said. It's survival. We spent that day working as if danger hadn't brushed our door. I fixed the shutter. She ground corn and boiled roots for broth. There was comfort in motion, in pretending normal could last. When the sun started to fall, she said, You don't belong to this land, but it listens to you. Maybe it's learning to trust me, I said. And I? You already do. That stopped her. She looked away, her cheeks coloring. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? Because I'll believe them. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Later that night, after supper, I took the harmonica from my pocket. I hadn't played it in years. My hands shook a little as I blew the first note low, uncertain, then stronger. The melody wasn't any tune I knew, just something the moment asked for. Naya listened, her head tilted, eyes closed. When I finished, she whispered, It sounds like home. I don't have one, I said. Then maybe we build one. Her words hit deeper than a bullet ever could. The wind outside shifted west, carrying the scent of wet cedar. The fire burned steady. She reached over and touched my arm, not out of fear, but gratitude. You could have left me, she said. I could have, I answered. But then I'd still be dead inside. Her eyes softened. Then I'm glad you didn't. We sat there a long time, listening to the rain taper off, to the land breathe again. The cabin, for all its cracks and scars, felt whole. And so did I. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate. Grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. By the time spring crept back across the basin, the land had changed. The river ran clear again, cutting silver through the valley. The cottonwoods had sprouted new leaves, small as coins but bright as hope. Even the wind seemed to move softer now, like it had forgotten how to hurt. For weeks, there were no riders, no threats, no letters. Just the hum of work and the comfort of routine. I fixed the roof, mended the fence, carved smoother handles for Naya's chair. She learned to cook beans without burning them, and I learned that silence didn't always mean loneliness. One morning I found her outside, sleeves rolled, turning soil with a wooden spade. Her arms were lean but strong, the sun glinting off the copper beads in her hair. "What are you planting?" I asked. "Corn," she said. "My mother once told me that when corn grows in hard ground, the spirits have blessed the home." I looked around at the cracked earth. "Then this place will need more than blessings." She smiled without looking up. "Faith doesn't wait for permission." I helped her dig. The dirt was rough, clinging to my palms, but for the first time I didn't mind. By noon, the seeds were buried, small and quiet under the dust. When the wind shifted, I could almost smell rain. That evening we sat on the porch. The sky stretched wide and endless, streaked with gold where the sun had begun to fall. I'd seen hundreds of sunsets in my years out here, but that one felt different, gentler somehow. Less like an ending, and more like the start of something trying to grow. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. "I used to," I said. "Every time I heard the wind in the trees, I thought it was the road calling. But now," I glanced toward the small garden patch, the cabin, the smoke curling from our chimney. "Now, I think maybe I'm where I was supposed to be." As left of the groove Dagana dafted. She was quiet a while, watching the light fade. "When my people left me," she said softly, "I prayed for someone to see me before the sun went down. I didn't pray for mercy, only for a witness. Someone who wouldn't look away. You were that." I shook my head. "I wasn't saving you. I was saving myself. Then we saved each other." Her voice carried something fragile but steady, like a truth finally spoken after too long. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Outside, the coyotes were quiet, and the land seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in years, I felt at peace with the sound of my own heart. The peace didn't last. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. 2 days later, I went out early for firewood. The air was still gray when I saw smoke curling over the ridge. Too thick for campfire, too black for storm. Trouble. When I rode back, 2 riders were already there, the same men I'd turned away weeks before. One held a torch, the other had his rifle drawn. "Morning," the leader said, grinning wide. "We heard the stories, thought we'd see for ourselves. Man living with an Indian cripple, that true?" "Leave," I said. He spat. "Or what?" I didn't answer. My rifle spoke for me. The shot cracked like thunder. The first man dropped. The second raised his gun, but Naya was faster. She'd crawled to the doorway, one hand steadying my revolver. The blast echoed through the basin. When the smoke cleared, both men were still. Naya's face was pale, her hands shaking. I took the pistol from her gently. "They would have burned it all," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But not while we're still breathing. 2,000 part." He turned one. We buried them before the sun went down. No prayers, just dirt. When it was done, she sat by the creek, staring at the water. "I thought I'd feel hate," she said. "But I don't, just tired." "That's what killing does," I said. "Takes the hate and leaves the emptiness." She turned to me, eyes reflecting the fading light. "And what does love leave?" I hesitated, then said quietly, "A reason to stay." She reached out, brushed my cheek with her hand, "Then stay."